Hello Math 152 students. In this video, we'll take a look at clarifying what hypothesis testing is, what we can do in the next two chapters, and how this applies to your projects. So we're going to wrap up the course by looking at actual questions and data we can collect to answer those questions. What we can actually test is a little bit limited. We are going to be looking at primarily means and proportions. The same two concepts we looked at in the previous chapters. We discussed the distribution of the sample mean, the distribution of the sample proportion. So those concepts are what we'll build on to test hypotheses. So let's talk about a sample topic that I've seen in a lot of projects. It seems like every semester, at least one group wants to talk about tattoos. So we'll just use that as an example. And you might make a hypothesis such as, our group thinks the proportion of students having tattoos is greater than it was 10 years ago. Maybe something like that. So that's comparing a current proportion to a previous value. So in order to actually test that hypothesis, you would have to be able to get sample data for whether students have tattoos or not, sort of a yes or no, and compare that to a prior percentage 10 years ago. Keep in mind that you want to think about things like clarifying your population. Are you interested in students, people in general, students at CVCC? You want to be as specific as you can and think about who your sample will actually be and comparing that to the previously established value. For example, you could compare the percent of students with tattoos at CVCC to the national average of people with tattoos. You could also turn this into a different type of test by looking at the number of tattoos. So you might say something like, we think men have more tattoos than women, greater number of tattoos than women. So instead of asking, do you have tattoos, which leads to a yes or no and a proportion, you could ask, how many do you have, which leads to an average number for men and women. So that's an example of looking at an average instead of a proportion, and then also comparing two groups. So notice there's no prior estimate. Again, there you want to think about your sample. Are you looking at CVCC students? Are you looking at Catawba County residents? Are you looking at your friends on Facebook? Make sure you're being really specific with your hypothesis to talk about who is in your sample. And then also make sure that if you're comparing to a previous value, you have access to that number. So that's just an example of how you could think about a topic, and there's different types of data you could collect. So in chapter 10, we'll look at proportions and comparing sample data to a previous proportion. So maybe something like the percent of students who have tattoos compared to 10 years ago. We'll also look at averages. So you might look at something like the average age at which someone moves out, like out of their parents' house, whether that's going to college, moving across the country, joining the military, moving out for whatever reason, and establishing their own residence, and whether that's increased or decreased from 10 years ago. That would be comparing an average age to a previously established value. In chapter 11, we'll compare two groups. For example, if you were looking at the average number of tattoos for men versus women, that's an average, but there's a comparison between two groups in your sample and not a prior value. Similarly, if you looked at the proportion of students who had tattoos and were comparing male and female, you would have to have a hypothesis, like which one you think is higher, but you would be comparing two groups. So think about your topic and your hypothesis in those terms. Chapter 10 will be comparing a sample proportion or a sample mean to a prior value. Chapter 11 compares two groups to one another. Some other things to think about are how to make your question more concrete and make it specific to the population you're looking at. So be careful that you don't make your hypothesis too general. If you are only looking at sampling CVCC students, your hypothesis should reflect that. If you are looking at sampling Catawba County residents, your hypothesis should reflect that. You don't want to collect data from a specific population and then make a generalization that's, oh, people in general have this trend, right? There might be something different going on in Catawba County demographics, for example, if you were looking at the average age in which you move out, that's different than another geographic location. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit. As you work on your projects, make sure you are sending me questions as you go through the hypothesis testing to make sure you understand how the concepts apply to your project.